with something that was all printed like that. And that number would change. You wouldn't pre-program a microchip. You'd put another microchip in, that would change.
Today I'm super excited because I'm heading up to Northamptonshire and I am going to Weatherbys. I'm going to meet Simon and I'm going to have a chat to him all about Weatherbys and what it is and what it does. So stay tuned to find out exactly what Weatherbys does. Horse racing has existed in Britain for hundreds of years, but it wasn't until the second half of the century that racing was properly organised and regulated. Weatherbys is primarily responsible for providing racing services to the BHA, such as race car production, pedigree research, printing, publishing, marketing and ticketing. I met with Simon Cooper, director here at Weatherbys. I was delighted to be there amongst rooms filled with books oozing with horse racing history. Not only did Simon tell me everything that I needed to know about Weatherbys, such as where it all began, the origin of the Thoroughbred, the future of horse racing and the future of the passport system. He also showed me some of the books in the rooms, and that is where we're going to start. Take a look at one of these books before we sit down with Simon.
Not necessarily to do with breeding or P&Ls, salaries, ledgers. There's a book here about a subscription book. So yeah, these are old subscriptions to the Jockey Club, the Earl of Jersey, Lord Kelborn, Mr. Irby. I mean, these are just sort of, every year they would have paid a subscription to be a member of the Jockey Club. So this is 1831, 32 through to 1839, just PD paid. And it looks like it's £2 and 2 shillings in this annual subscription, which is pretty good going.
Yeah. What's it now?
Sir Gilbert Heathcote. Good question, I don't know.
Big price difference.
Big price difference, yes. The Earl of Grove. But Weatherbys is effectively the organisation that helps to administer British racing, and that includes a wide range of different functions. So, for example, the entries. So in order to send a horse to the races, you have to enter that horse in an event, in a race. That is done by Weatherbys. So those entries are taken. You have to declare the jockey. You have to make sure there's enough prize money there, which is given out to the winner of the race. You have to keep that prize money. So Weatherbys looks after that prize money in its role as bankers to racing. We also print the race cards. So all the race cards, whether it's digital or actually in paper form, that you have at the races to look who's running, who's riding, who's the trainer, who's the owner, what are the colours. That's done by Weatherbys as well. We also produce the pedigrees for the sales catalogue. So when horses are bought and sold at the sales, those pedigrees are produced for the catalogues. That's done by Weatherbys. We also register the horses. So the stud book is the original register of the competitors. Every sport has to register the competitors, whether it's athletics, whether it's football, whether it's whatever sport it is, and we do that. So that's the stud book side of it.
How much do you reckon it weighs?
I would say that's probably a good part of 10 kilos.
Oh gosh.
All aspects of a day at the races, somewhere behind the scenes, Weatherbys is involved in making sure that that event runs as smoothly as possible.
Now talk about the history of Weatherbys, because that's something I find so interesting, and who it began with.
So you have to go back a long way, about 252 years, when James Weatherby, he was a solicitor in Newcastle, he was asked to move by the head of the Jockey Club, which was a very, very early version of the Jockey Club. So this was a jockey club that would meet in coffee houses, didn't really have a central office, didn't really regulate the sport in the way that we know today. And so Sir Giles Bunbury, who was then the senior steward, asked if James Weatherby, who was a solicitor in Newcastle, if he would come down to Newmarket, which is where the centre of racing was, and try and put some proper functions in place to administer racing properly and professionally, so that you had race meetings set out, you know which competitors, were running in it, you know which jockeys were riding those horses, you knew where it was happening, you knew there was enough prize money for those events. Things such as colours then were added, making sure that the races were published. So the racing calendar, which we still produce today, was first produced. Everyone could see in the racing calendar where the races were taking place, who was running, what the distance of the race was. All of these aspects were not really set down in stone. So in 1770, he moved from Newcastle down to Newmarket and effectively set up the first office for the administration of racing. And that was added to 21 years later with the General Stud Book. So he then wanted to make sure that who was competing, that horse should be registered, so we knew who the horse was. So you couldn't put in a horse that wasn't actually the horse that you said it was. Although later on, in the middle of the 19th century, there were a couple of challenges to that, where horses actually who won the Derby were not the horses that they claimed they were. They were taken to court and actually they won those cases. The famous one was in 1844 with a horse called Running Rein, was actually a horse called Maccabeus. So that was the first time, back in 1770, it's the first time we really put some order in place, and that's the basis of how racing is run today. The rules of racing, quite complicated. Those were put in place for the first time. A proper structure around the racing. So it was moving effectively from an amateur sport to a professional sport. So that's how it started, and then over those preceding 252 years, obviously a lot more work has gone into ensuring that racing has full integrity. The horses, the welfare of the horses is absolutely paramount. The administration of it, the financial side of it, all of these aspects have become much more sophisticated, and that's where it started back in 1770.
The Thoroughbred was essentially created, wasn't it? Can you just tell me about where that breed began?
Of course, there were. Well, it was effectively going back to what I've just spoken about, which is the creation of a register. So the first time that in this country that you were required by law to register your child, for example, was in about 1837. But go back 50 years and you had to register your thoroughbred foal if it was going to race. So the stud book was created. And they would have put it, glued in the pages from the previous stud book 4 years before, and then they would have, as the information came in by letter, this one from Sir G. Cholmondeley in 1867, 1868, and Mr. Davidson, whose mares Abyss and Abaft, they were owned by them, and they would have written in, as you can see, written in hand, the foals from those mares, the date, died in July 1865, and they would have put in these little notes, and then somebody would have had to turn these notes in the old stud book, and I mean all these, they would have all been handwritten. They would have then turned this information into hot metal and had it printed into the printed form. So they would have then ended up with something that was all printed like that. So somebody would have had to put all that together, and the work that would have gone into putting the handwritten version into that would have been much greater than the work that went into doing the handwritten part. So the stud book was created, and you had to start somewhere. So James Weatherby and his nephew, who was also called James Weatherby, went off and talked to all the breeders and said, right, we want a record of all the horses you've got, your mares, your stallions, your foals, the years they will foaled. So they started to put together this register, but the basis of the thoroughbred breed had happened before that, really in the middle of the 18th century, even earlier than that, in the early part of the 18th century, when people were British, particularly noblemen, travelled overseas, particularly to the Middle East, and they bought horses and they brought them back to England and they bred them to their mares, mostly hunting mares, and they created these faster horses. And that was really where it came from. There were three particularly dominant stallions who came all from the Middle East. One was from Syria, one was from Yemen, and they were brought to England. They were bred to local mares, and that was the beginning of the thoroughbred. And the horses got faster and faster, and they were injected with Arabian speed, And that became what is now known as and there was one particularly dominant stallion called the Darley Arabian. Mr. Darley brought it over, and he is now, his DNA is in about 95% of all thoroughbreds, because the thoroughbred was created in Britain, and then it spread, it was exported across the world, and it became a breed that is now registered in about 70 different countries. There are about 70 thoroughbred stud books around the world, but it did originate in Britain in about 1790, 91. But the horses themselves that then created the first stud book were being developed sort of 50 to 100 years before that, and that was the first time that they actually started to catalogue these horses, and that's when they named it the thoroughbred. So the thoroughbred, if you were to, for example, the horse was created in a very different form about 50 million years ago. It was about the size of a spaniel. It was four-toed rather than soliped it is now. And that creature has developed over the years, and the thoroughbred is probably one of the last in that chain of evolution. If you were, for example, to condense that evolution of the horse into 24 hours, the thoroughbred has come along in the last 0.2 of a second. So it's very late in the day, and it's only, as I say, about 230 to 240 years old. But it's become a very important and a very well-known breed in its own right.
With the Arabian stallion, in Arabic horses, they have a dish. Is that why some thoroughbreds have a slight dish? Is that the Arabian horse genetic coming through?
Yes, it is. It is. I mean, it is, and particularly if it was the stallions were dominant. So you could, every creature takes 50% of its chromosomes or its DNA from each parent. So these stallions were injecting effectively 50% of the gene pool into the thoroughbred breed. And so the characteristics of the Arab horse, the classic Arab horse, were very much injected into this refined breed, whereas the old hunting mares, some of them with Roman noses, heavy boned, were refined with this injection of stallion blood from the Arabs, became much more refined, became faster, more nimble, and slightly lighter boned, you know, in some cases much lighter boned compared to the old heavy horses in the old days, absolutely.
Have the shape of horses changed throughout time? Because you know, some horses, they're a lot finer than other horses. Do you think the impact of inbreeding and things like that, do you think that's changing over time to make the horse change? Has it changed?
I think it is, and in fact, even if you look at thoroughbreds in other parts of the world, there are slight differences. I mean, now it's becoming such a global business. You do have the very classic look of the thoroughbred. But you're right, it's an ever-changing, evolutionary, and sometimes fashionable thing. Certain things, much as in any sport involving animals, there are certain fashions, certain trends that happen over time. But you're right, yes, it's becoming a more refined animal, faster animal. And also the thoroughbred it's a very amenable animal. It's an intelligent animal. It's handled from day one. So thoroughbreds tend to be very adaptable. They can enjoy other sports after racing. If they never race, they can go into other sports. And again, they adapt very quickly.
Do you think there's a possibility, perhaps in the future, of injecting a different breed into the thoroughbred, perhaps to make it sturdier over fences? Would that be a possibility?
At the moment, the rules don't allow that. It is what they call a closed stud book. So you can only breed a thoroughbred with a thoroughbred to create a thoroughbred. You can't take a thoroughbred and another breed and then create a thoroughbred. They're simply not allowed to be registered in the thoroughbred stud book. So that's what we call a closed breed. So at the moment, no, that's not possible. But who knows, in 50 years, 100 years' time, because it's a closed stud book and the inbreeding coefficient may be going up, people might decide, long after I'm no longer involved in the business, might decide that actually that's a good thing for the thoroughbred, that we do inject another breed in there to spread out again, lower that inbreeding coefficient and spread out that gene pool a bit more. Who knows? But at the moment, no, you can't do that.
Let's start now from the thoroughbred as a foal, and then all the way up until its racing career. What is Weatherby's role in that horse?
So it really starts before the foal is even born, we register all the coverings. So the conception of that foal is registered with the stud book. And then we register the foal after it's born within 30 days. So that's a requirement in this country. You have to register that or notify the stud book of that foal's existence. And then it's registered. And at that point, when it's registered in the stud book, actually included in the database, then becomes a thoroughbred, and it's issued with a passport. And these days, you've got the paper passports, you've also got digital passports, which we're now producing. So everything is now on a telephone or a tablet or a PC. But your basic information is notified after 30 days. The registration carries a lot more information. So you have, for example, the microchip number. That's done by a vet. You also have the horse's DNA. So there's a lot more information about the thoroughbred that we retain, you could argue, than, for example, the information we retain on humans. You also, you've microchipped it, you've taken its DNA, so you've checked that the parents of the parents that you've been told that horses, the father and mother, are the correct ones. And the DNA test will tell you that. That parentage verification test will tell you whether that's true or not. And occasionally we do get a horse that doesn't have the right parents, and that's normally something that can be sorted out, and it's usually a clerical error or whatever. And then you've also got the markings. So this is equivalent to your passport photo. So the horse's outline, its face, all its markings, it's white, the white bits on its legs or on the face, the whorls, which are those little circles of hair. That's all recorded in the markings. So you then have, and everything else about that horse, when it was born, where it was born, who its parents are, who owns it, etc., etc. That's all in there in that passport. So it's issued with a passport. It then is a thoroughbred. Normally, then it would be with the breeder until it's probably a yearling. So a year after it's a foal. Some of those horses, about 50%, would go to the yearling sales, and they would be sold, and they would be bought by somebody who wants to race that horse. That horse is then prepared for racing, and that's quite a lengthy and careful process to ensure that the horse is happy to take on its purpose in life, and that it's happy under the saddle, and it's happy to run, and it's encouraged, and you have to really positively encourage. And in the old days, when the awful term breaking a horse was to basically make sure the horse did what you were told, a bit like Victorian schools, you did what you were told. These days it's much more positive encouragement, so that horse actually enjoys what it's doing and it does what it was bred to do, its purpose in life. And that normally would involve a pre-trainer, somebody who would take it through its steps, teaching it what it is to race, teaching about the equipment, teaching it about going out on the gallops with a whole lot of other horses, riding alongside other horses, all of that training that in any sports, you learn how to play that game, how to perform to your best in that sport. And then it would enter training, and that would either be to the tail end of its yearling career, or maybe as an early 2-year-old, depends really when the foal was born, if it's a precocious horse or not. It would go to the trainer, normally, as I say, at the end of its yearling or at the beginning of its 2-year-old life. And then it would be with the trainer. And the trainer would assess it and work out whether, is it a sprinter, is it a stayer, does it like running over long distances, short distances, does it enjoy jumping over fences? It would work out what the horse likes, dislikes, what it's good at, what it isn't good at. And then you start to build a career for that horse. And that will take you through its training career.
So now, because I was explaining to you earlier that I've got an ex-racehorse and I've been given the passport, can you just explain to me what the process will be for me now to do with that passport now I have rehomed a racehorse?
That's terrific, because there are always horses out there which have finished their racing careers. They're looking for new homes, and so that's wonderful what you've done. So the process is a relatively simple one. Everything is online now, so everything that a trainer or an owner will do in interacting with us in terms of what that horse does, where that horse goes, whether it's vaccinated or not, etc., etc., is all done online. And there is a form on the system, on our system, that trainer or an owner can go to and say, this horse is now retired, he's no longer enjoys racing, doesn't want to continue racing, he's too slow, whatever it might be. That horse is then retired, and that's officially done online through the site, which is a British Horse Racing Authority site, which we look after. And it will inform everybody that that horse has now finished its racing career. It's really then up to the owner and the trainer as to what the next step is. Do they have somebody, maybe in their family, maybe a friend who would like to take on that horse, somebody local who wants to take it just hacking, or wants to compete perhaps in 3D eventing or show jumping or something, or polo, any of those sports, because that horse, having been a thoroughbred and having been trained as a thoroughbred, will be very adaptable. So it's really a question of finding, and there are lots and lots of people throughout the country who specialise in finding those, who will have contacts, who will find certain horses that they like and want to use. And they'll take those horses on and they'll retrain them for the sport that they would like them to do. So there's a number of different avenues, and there's a wonderful organisation called the Retraining of Racehorses, which assesses horses when they leave racing to say, is this horse suitable for perhaps show jumping, or where can we find a home? And they're, if you like, a conduit between the racing industry and where that horse is going to have its second career outside racing. So it's a very well-oiled machine now. Not always the case, but nowadays it's a very well-oiled machine in terms of that transition. The passport remains with the horse, whether it's racing or not. It's been given a passport, either digital or paper or both. That remains with the horse for the rest of its life. So that's in the same way humans have a passport for life. That's the Thoroughbred passport. So as you see, we've got all the basic information about the horse. And you've got on here the actual written markings. So, for example, it says feather, cordial radius, etc., etc., and then quite a detailed on the body and neck, quite a detailed description there. And then on the next page, you'll see there'll actually be a markings chart, which will show the various marks, where the whorls are, where the microchip is. You see that M there. So that's a bit like your photograph in your passport. But just going back to the first page. So you've got the date of birth, you've got the horse, what gender it is, country of birth, and then you've got the unique lifetime number. So every single horse is given a unique lifetime number. That is the number, if above all others, you would keep. If, for example, the microchip number could change, very rare, but it could change. If a microchip, for whatever reason, no longer works, or it, for some reason, malfunctions, you would insert another microchip and that number would change. You wouldn't pre-program a microchip, you'd put another microchip in, that would change. But the unique lifetime number never changes. You've got its colour, you've got its markings, and you've got various things which we put in here to distinguish this from other countries' passports. So we have a hologram there, Weatherbys hologram. We have special Weatherbys printed paper. We have the cover, for example, has an embossed Weatherbys on it. We have embossed rivets on the passport. So somebody takes those rivets out, they won't be able to reproduce those unless they're very, very clever. So a number of different things are put in there to try and make sure that as much as we can, this is not tampered with or faked or changed in any way. You then got the name of the breeder, parentage tested, microchip number, and then on every single page you've got that unique lifetime number on every single page. So if any page is ever taken out and replaced, again, you've got that level of security. Then you've got the markings, and that, as I say, is a bit like the horse, the human photograph in a human passport. Some countries do use photographs. America, for example, does have photographs, again, as sort of another layer of information. And then you've got various sections through the passport, whether it's medication, whether it's the horse has had international movements, its vaccinations, various sections in here which are unique to that horse. And there are the vaccinations, for example, when it's had its flu and tetanus, signed by the vet, stamped by the vet. Now that is now for the last 2 years we've issued, and there's the first page of the vaccinations you can see there, and the various sections there. So identification of the animal, control of the identification of the animal, various sections across the whole of Europe. This is exactly the same. Certificate of origin, its breeding, its certificate of origin validated when it was validated 1st of August 2018, stud book, etc., which stud book it is. So this is the Weatherbys stud book for Britain and Ireland. So all of this information is in the paper version, and that horse carries that passport for its entire life. It goes with the horse from, if it changes ownership, it will go with the horse to the owner, and it is as good as an identification publication as you can get. However, that doesn't stop people from trying to either change things, change pages, or try fraudulent things. So that's why for the last 2 years we've produced a passport on the mobile phone or a tablet or a PC, all that information through the Weatherbys app, which is the e-passport app, and you can download it from the App Store. That will be on the phone. You can type in the details of the horse, either its unique lifetime number, its microchip number, or put in the details. You will find that horse on the e-passport. But we're currently producing both those because the European Union insists that we have the paper passport, and if the horse is ever exported to the European Union, you have to produce a paper passport. So we're currently doing both. But there will come a time, I'm sure, when you will only have, much as we humans only travel with these days, we don't have bits of paper, or generally we don't have bits of paper. The same will be for horses in not too distant future, we hope. Unlike humans, we don't have to change it every 5 or 10 years, but so that has that passport. Weatherbys therefore have to be informed as to what happens to that horse. If that horse dies, we have to be informed, we have to have the passport returned to us so that we can log that on the system, so we know that that horse has died, or it has moved owners. We have to be told, and that is actually law now. Within 30 days of a horse changing ownership, we have to be informed that that ownership has changed. And that's something that we're always trying to improve. We're always trying to encourage people who may not have come across horse ownership before, may not have been involved in the racing industry, may not know who Weatherbys are. We're trying to encourage them to know that if you've changed a horse's ownership within 30 days, if you haven't done that change of ownership, you're actually breaking the law. So we're trying to encourage that a lot more and get people to inform us about that horse's change of ownership. But it's very important that those horses are found second careers, and there are a lot of people doing some fantastic work around that.
How do Weatherbys monitor where horses go in their lives, whether it's rehoming? How do Weatherbys make sure they're going to the right places?
It's a good question, and we, one of the sort of big breakthroughs, which we haven't got there yet, would be a microchip that's actually active. Currently, microchips are passive, so in order to read the number of a microchip, which every racehorse has and has had inserted since 1999, so for the last 22 years, we've had all thoroughbreds have had a microchip. That microchip gives you a number, and that is unique to that horse, so you know which horse that is. You go into the database and you say, that's that horse, and you can see its life. What we would like to do is have an active chip, but that involves a microchip that is sending out a signal, and that would require a battery that would last a decent amount of time. At the moment, microchips are injected as a foal, usually at a very early stage in a foal's life, hardly feels it, goes into the nuchal ligament of the neck, and it stays there for the rest of its life. But with an active microchip, that would send out a signal, and you could actually GPS track horses. We haven't got there yet, so we're reliant on owners keeping us informed, whether it's whoever owns the horse, keeping us informed as to where that horse is. So that's an area that science and technology could really help us with, but we haven't got there yet. So we, as I say, we're reliant on owners informing us within 30 days of that horse changing owners. We also, I think, the government's looking at having equine premises numbers, which farm animals have. So if you move a horse from one EPN or county parish holding number to another, again, you have to inform the central database of that change. So again, that would help with the tracking. But again, that's something that's evolving as we're talking.
And are Weatherbys working on this, or would a separate company be working on this?
We already have, with the Thoroughbred Breeders Association, we already have developed an equine premises number. So we have equine premises numbers for all breeders currently. But it's not a requirement of the law. It's not a requirement of government and DEFRA to have that. So we're very much working with government to try and introduce that on a wider scale, not just for thoroughbreds, but for all horses across the country.
Now I want to go all the way back to what you said in the beginning, where Weatherbys do the owner's colours and the horses' names. Previously, when I was in one of your conferences, you spoke about the choosing of a horse's name. Now, I didn't realise that has to be approved. So can you just tell me the process and what happens there?
It does. There are always people trying to get names which should perhaps not be in the public domain through. So they do have to be checked, and there's quite a rigorous process and various dictionaries in the office in terms of different languages, different slang terms, and so on and so forth. So yes, it's not to say that every single one is picked up. One or two have slipped through. But we do have a quite rigorous process for naming, and not just rigorous in terms of whether it has to be the right length, so it cannot be more than 18 letters, can't have numbers in it. There are various rules about what you can use as a name and what you can't use as a name, and for very sensible reasons. But it's a bit more than that. We obviously have roughly 85,000 foals, thoroughbred foals born a year across the world. And most of those will be named at some stage in their life. And so there's a lot of names out there which could be repeated. So there's a lot of liaison between the different racing jurisdictions around the world to make sure that we don't double up. In the old days, for example, you had two stallions, one born in Ireland, one born in GB, both called Bold Lad, which caused quite a lot of confusion. So nowadays it's much more rigorously checked, and also we've got a system of protected names, what we call protected names. So if a horse wins a Grade 1 race or Group 1 race, for example, or is a well-known stallion or well-known mare, that name becomes protected and nobody else can have that name. So a name like Mill Reef, for example, you couldn't have another horse called Mill Reef. So that's now much more controlled, and we look after that. Colours is probably a little bit simpler in that there are a certain number of different patterns and designs for the sleeves, the cap, the body. And you can go online. If you go onto the BHA website, you can actually design your own colours, and you can have all sorts of different things, stripes and hoops and spots and all the rest of it. And you can just design your colours and your shapes and so on and so forth. So that you can have a bit of fun with that. And that was first brought in, again, going right back in time to the time of James Weatherby, when there were no colours. So people had problems recognising when they watched a race who won the race, who was second, and they brought in colours for the first time at about that time. And I think it was 17 sets of colours that were first published or first registered. And there's one, I think I'm right in saying there's one set of colours which is still in operation today, more than 250 years later, which is the Duke of Devonshire's straw colours, and they are still registered today, and they were part of that original 17 sets of colours. And all of that is again, it's there to ensure that there's no confusion for people going racing either for the first time or they've been many times before, or just watching racing on television, that it's absolutely clear you're following a horse, that's your horse. It's got a number on it, it's got its own colours, and you know absolutely that that's the horse to follow. That's your horse.
So you can't have random patterns. It's either there's like a specific template. Hoops,
there is a specific template.
stripes.
But I think I'm right in saying that all the different combinations, if you were to run an algorithm on all the different combinations in terms of caps, sleeves, bodies, the different alternatives you can have are something like 10 million. There are 10 million different combinations and colours that you could have. So I don't think we're ever going to run out of different. But we've had some, and there is a premium value in, for example, all blue, all scarlet, all white, and there's some anomalies too in Lord Derby's colours, for example, black with one white button. And that came about through, I think it was a horse called Sansevino. And the jockey came out and he'd got his stock underneath his silks caught in the button. So he had one white button. The horse won, and Lord Derby ever after that said, that's lucky. So all my colours are now going to have one white button on the front of the jacket. So lots of stories about colours and names, but we could be here forever if I started down that line.
While we're on the topic of statistics, I asked you earlier a rough figure of how many registered thoroughbreds you reckon there were since it all began, and how many was that?
It's a good question. It's a very difficult one. I mean, if you were to take a straight line in a very simple form, take a straight line from the let's say several hundred when we started to the time 15, 20 years ago when we were producing around about 125,000, perhaps more thoroughbreds per year across the globe. That number's come down now. You did a straight line from 1791 with the first thoroughbred stud book, and if actually you could go a bit earlier than that because there were thoroughbreds being born which subsequently got registered in the stud book in 1791 for the first time. I would say back of envelope, very much back of envelope, I would say you're talking north of 10 million thoroughbreds across their history, if you like.
How do you monitor breeding and make sure that, I suppose, to make sure that Britain isn't overbreeding to then make sure there's not wasted thoroughbreds?
Again, a good question. In fact, we're in a very interesting position here because very like Australia and New Zealand, one of those countries is a big breeder and the other country races a lot more. So in the case of Australia, they have a lot of races, but they proportionately, the New Zealanders next door breed a lot more horses than they probably need. So they sell half their horses to Australia, or their foal crops, every year. Pretty much half of them end up in Australia, roughly. It's the same with us in Ireland. Ireland is a perfect place for breeding horses. They've got an incredible history of horsemanship and horse just breeding horses generally. And it's a big part of pretty big part of their economy. We don't breed enough horses in this country for our racing program. So if we were just to rely on British bred horses, we would have to reduce the size of our racing, roughly 3 meetings a day, roughly 6, 7, 8 races a day, roughly 10, 11, 12 horses per race. So you start to add those numbers up. We wouldn't have enough horses. So we end up buying over 60% of the horses that Ireland breeds, that they come over to Britain and they race over here. So we've got this very good sort of synergy between the two countries in terms of providing the market that needs those horses. And we've also got a great competition between Britain and Ireland, particularly around the Cheltenham Festival and jumping, and other meetings as well. This is fantastic. And it's the same with New Zealand and Australia. Really good rivalry, good competition. But the breeding itself, Ireland actually breeds twice as many thoroughbreds as this country does. Their foal crop annually is around about 9,500. Ours is around about 4,500. So that works for both countries extremely well.
Is there a big difference in an Irish bred horse to a English bred horse?
I would say you might get scientists and others and real breeding experts to say this is the case, but not really, because it is now such a global industry, and we send over, well over 1,200, perhaps even 1,500 mares a year to Irish stallions, and they would send the same number over to our stallions over here. So there's a real crossover, mix of blood, if you like, between Irish breds and British breds. The determining what suffix, either GB or IRE, it's going to carry after its name is purely decided as where the foal is born. So the mare may be in Ireland, but is normally domiciled in Britain. But if it's foaled in Ireland, it'll be an Irish bred, and if it's an Irish mare that happens to be in Britain at the time the mare foals, then it'll be a GB bred. But there's a real crossover in terms of the bloodlines. You could, in fact, the stud book, although we have different sections in the stud book, in the general stud book for Irish mares and British mares, it's actually one stud book. So we have the same rules, we have the same conditions. British and Irish racing and breeding is extremely close and runs along the same lines, even to the extent where the Northern Irish race courses are actually funded and run by Horse Racing Ireland. So it's a really good, I think anyway, synergistic arrangement between the two countries.
I didn't realise how many horses there were until I went to the sales. So many. But what happens to the ones that they're not sold on that day? Where do they go?
They would either go back to their breeder, who might find another sale for them, because there are lots of different stages that you could sell a horse at. There are foal sales. So the end of the December sales, for example, when the foals are coming up for a year old, foals, when they've been weaned from their mothers, they can be sold as foals, they can be sold as yearlings. And different horses develop at different times and will be much more attractive at different times. So you might get a foal that's born in June, won't be looking too strong as a foal in December. As a yearling, it will probably have caught up with its year group. And certainly by the time it's a 2-year-old, it will have caught up with its year group. And you'll get yearlings that take longer to develop, much like humans, where you get some people who'll quite precocious, and others who'll take longer to sort of grow and become athletes, if you like. So you will find a sale to suit that horse. But the ones that, let's say, would not be sold as yearlings, often will end up being bought privately by somebody who says, I think that horse has got real potential. It may not look its best now because it was a late foal, it's quite young, it's a bit weak at the moment, but give it another 6 months and I think that horse is going to look fantastic. And they will buy it privately, and then they'll take it to the 2-year-old sales the following year, or again sell it privately when they've prepared it and it's looking a lot better, and and then they can make a little bit of money on it. And so there are different stages in a horse's life, and then horses are bought and sold in training. They're bought and sold when they leave racing and end up going back into breeding, as a lot of them do. They can be sold at that stage. So all the way through their life, there will be opportunities. If they're not suited to racing for whatever reason, they will end up in another sport, or as somebody's just riding horse. Or they may go racing overseas. They may be exported. Somebody in Sweden or France or Australia or wherever it happens to be will say, I like that pedigree, I like that horse, I'm going to race it where I am, and I think it's got real potential there, whereas it might not have suited this country for whatever reason.
Can other people from other sports go to the sales to get horses for their particular sport? It doesn't have to be horse racing.
Absolutely. I mean, the challenge they'll have is that thoroughbreds sell probably for a lot more in many cases than sports horses or polo ponies, for example. So the prices will be high. So yes, we do have there's certainly people who will come along to the sales, but you'll find, for example, 3-day eventers will often buy a horse from a well-known person who specialises in retraining that horse from racing life to 3-day eventing life. So, and then they will take that horse through the grades, and it'll become quite well known in the 3-day eventing circles, and then that horse will be sold to somebody higher up the chain. So all the horses will find their level, much like children do at school, much like athletes do in sports events. Everyone finds their level wherever they are, and there's always opportunities. I mean, as I said earlier, the great thing about thoroughbreds is they're so versatile because they're handled from day one. They're intelligent, and they just adapt to other sports. You know, they're fantastic from that point of view. Whether it's dressage or polo or whatever it happens to be, they find a life somewhere.
They're brilliant. And lastly, if someone at home is watching and they want to learn more about Weatherbys, where can they go?
There is a website, www.weatherbys.co.uk. We are actually we're publishing a book later this year on the history of Weatherbys. I don't know whether that'll be online, but there's certainly we've just had our 250th, 2 years ago we had our 250th anniversary since we started, so we're publishing a book in just to recognise that. So there's a lot of different, and the BHA website, which is effectively, Weatherbys is the back office for the British Horse Racing Authority, so the BHA website also has a lot of information which is around Weatherbys and what we do. And there's also the Weatherbys Bank site, there's Weatherbys Insurance, Weatherbys Hamilton Insurance, there is the main Weatherbys site, which is gives you the sort of racing side of things. So yes, lots of places you can go to find out about what goes on behind the scenes of racing. How do we end up with a race meeting? What happens before we get to that point?
That's why I love it, because like I was saying to you earlier, there's so much within the sport to learn about, not just what you see on the outside. It's a whole maze.
It is. I would say it's the most complicated sport. It's often, most sports have fairly straightforward rules. You either have to score a goal, or you have to hit the ball over the boundary, or kick it over some posts. So they're pretty straightforward. Racing is highly complicated. It involves so many different parts, because you've got the jockeys, you've got the horses. The horses always come first, but you've got the trainers, you've got the owners, you've got the person who likes to bet on a horse, you've got the person who likes to go racing, you've got the breeder, you've got the person who, the stable grooms and the staff behind the scenes. So they've got the shipping companies, the vets. It's a massively complicated industry and many parts to it. But that also gives you an enormous number of different routes to go down. If somebody's interested in getting into the racing industry, it's not just you have to be this or you have to be that. There's a vast array of different careers, whether you want to be a bloodstock agent or an insurance broker or a banker or a jockey or whatever it happens to be. There's an enormous number of different avenues you can go down in the racing industry.